You're seeing suppliers that shut down factories, that lost people, that are no bidding work. The capacity that the industry has today versus the demand that's out there today, there's a significant gap.
This is the Time on Wing podcast. Welcome back. I'm Courtney Miller with Visual Approach Analytics. With me, as always, Garrick Deschavon of Collateral Verifications. Garrick, who's our victim today?
Hello, Courtney. Today we are speaking with Gary Weissel. And for those of you who don't know Gary, he's done some pretty cool stuff. And I've known him for a long time, and so it's going to be a lot of fun to chat with him. But so Gary is currently the managing officer for Tronos Aviation Consulting, and so we'll hear about all the different stuff that they do, which they've got some pretty interesting projects, which is cool. But before that, he was a VP and co-managing officer at ICF SH&E. He was also a senior program manager for BE Aerospace, product manager for Delta Airlines, a little airline that we all know. He is also currently a mentor in residence at the Georgia Institute of Technology School of Aerospace Engineering. And he received his BAE in Aerospace Engineering from Georgia Institute of Technology, right? It's a coincidence? I don't know. But anyway, so he's been doing some cool stuff in aviation. So great guy. We'll definitely look forward to speaking with him today. So Gary, this is your time on wing. So before we get on with our guest, which you guys are going to absolutely love, we obviously, first of all, we want to thank all our listeners for listening to us and making the show what it is today. And we certainly welcome any of you to, whenever you see us at conferences, just please say hello, and we'd love to hear that you guys are listening and fans of the show. As you all know, we do run businesses, and so from my end at Collateral Verifications, on the appraisal side, right, obviously if you have any needs when it comes to aircraft, engine, landing gear, you name it, right, just please feel free to reach out. I'm very approachable. I'm happy to chat about any kind of projects, and we'd love to work with you on a variety of things. We do have some publications out there as well. I do Turbine Aircraft Guide, Turboprop Value Guide. I've got the Aircraft Rating Tool. So there's various publications that we put together that can kind of help you on your day-to-day. Great reference points. So definitely, kind of reach out to us, and we'd love to chat and kind of start that relationship with you.
Okay, back to the show.
Gary, thank you very much for being on the podcast with us. We can't wait to hear how you got your start in aviation. It's something that we ask all of our guests. So we'd love to kind of get your take on how you get to start doing what you're doing today, and take us all the way through Tronos and all that stuff. But love to hear from you and kind of how you get started.
Thank you both for inviting me. When I told my wife, she said they must have really run out of people.
We did.
You know what? All of our guests say that. All of our guests say that. So I guess we're just
the other guests,
we keep running out.
Why am I here? A little bit of imposter.
Yeah, no, we're really scraping the bottom here, Gary. I'm not gonna lie.
Yeah. Well, what's amazing is that when you go through the list of all it takes is for somebody to send out a post or an email, or you see something and you're like,
yeah,
we get it. We got to have these people on, right? And you just out of sight, out of mind, right? Until you see it and you're like, man, that'd be really interesting. And it's not. So it has nothing to do with oh no, we've talked to everybody else. Let's find some other schmo to just kind of get him on, right?
Yeah.
But anyway,
I'll let frankly, you go. Nobody does what you do, at least not to this level, and it's interesting.
I've got a lot of interesting stuff I've done, and we're happy to kind of talk about everything. I think about...
And that's why we reached out.
Thank you. So when I think about sort of the beginning of my career, aviation, I always when I was middle school, I always wanted to be a doctor. I don't know why. I always wanted to be a doctor. And people often ask me, when did you switch to aviation? Because I knew I wanted to do aviation by the time I was in high school. I think probably I had a friend whose dad had must have been a Piper Archer. I must have been 10 or 11 years old. His dad was a real estate agent and worked at the post office or something. And I remember his dad taking me going up one afternoon with his dad flying in the airplane. I just thought that was the coolest thing. And then, I'm sure, stuff like Top Gun and all that kind of stuff I was sort of in high school by then hit me. But by the time I was a junior in high school, I had sort of made the decision I want to go into aerospace engineering. That's what I want to do. And so, I grew up in the Northeast and then went to Georgia Tech and got my aerospace engineering degree at Georgia Tech. That was fun. I would think I was the first. Back then, Tech was smaller. I think I was the first person from my town to ever go to Georgia Tech. I'd never even heard of it. I'd been applying to all the schools in the Northeast, and my mom was a guidance counselor. A funny story, my mom was a guidance counselor or a career counselor in one of the neighboring high schools, and this was back like Barron's days, you bring the big books home. And I was doing like Cornell and all these other, you had to write 8 essays, and it was like, my mom literally brought home the Georgia Tech application, and it was bubble, like front and back. Like, do you have a pulse? And, you live in Georgia, what's your GPA? And I was like, oh yeah, hell, I could do that. Like 20 minutes, I did it, gave it to her, got in, went and, sort of that was the rest of the, got in, went down, visited it, fell in love with the school. Plus, it was far enough away. I kind of wanted to go away from home. That was sort of, my brother had gone close to home. I wanted to branch out. So, said my first call, I think, by November Gary? Of my freshman year. So, Boston.
Where was home? Oh,
yeah. It was a little bit of a culture shock. South of the Mason-Dixon line. So there were people on my floor my freshman year that I could not understand what they were saying. They were like from southern Georgia. But anyway, so I actually got part of going to Georgia Tech. I had to co-op to help pay my way through school. So it's a 5-year program, and it adds a year. But we were on quarters then, so you go to school full time or you work full time. And the school helped me get a job. My first job was actually with Rolls, and they had an engine office down here, and it got canceled before I started. And I was home in Boston, and I got a phone call, and they said, sorry to tell you, but Rolls canceled the co-op. You have no job, but we got you an interview with Delta. Can you get on a flight tomorrow and fly down and do an interview with Delta? So I did, got on with Delta, and sort of the rest is history. I co-opted Delta, then I went into, then I got a full-time job at Delta. And I was at Delta for a total of about 9.5 years. I started like in the engine shop. I did performance engineering. I was a repair engineer in the engine shop, landing gear, fuel components, oil components, all the back shops, what we had called TOC1. So systems and repair engineering, plating shop. I mean, I learned sort of all the ins and outs of engines as well, and landing gear. Was involved in a number of different kind of sort of high-profile accidents, or I'll call them incidents and investigations during my time there, which was really interesting. And then I knew I was in trouble when the CEO, and at the time even Ray Vallecca, if you know that name, Ray Vallecca was the SVP of Delta Tech Ops at the time. He had been at Pan Am and Eastern and Continental, and was sort of an industry stalwart in the tech ops side of aviation. He didn't know my name, but he knew me as the little landing gear engineer down the hall. Same with Ron Allen. They knew me as the little landing gear engineer down the hall. And I loved it. But I was like, I was looking around, and there were a bunch of like ex-Pan Am. We'd merged with Pan Am while I was at Delta. Some ex-Pan Am guys. And, I was like, these guys are in their 60s, literally doing the same thing they've been doing for 60 years. 30, 40, 50 years. And I'm like, I don't want to be doing this. So one of my former guys I worked with was over in interiors, and he said, why don't you come work in interiors? And I was like, interiors? I don't want to deal with like drink carts and, folding chairs. I mean, I'm dealing with stuff where if I screw up, people die, right? I don't want to deal with interiors.
Yeah, but in interiors, if you screw up, they ring the call button, which is worse.
Literally, this is back in the early 90s, right? There were 2 women in engineering. Okay, there were we had maybe 10 to 12,000 employees that worked at Delta Tech Ops. All the women were they were all secretaries. We had a few mechanics that were female back then. Yeah. We had a director of engineering that was a female. That was an odd one, but she was a wonderful boss. But she came in from flight. She was flight attendant. Somehow, ended up being director of engineering, which is another story. She was one of the best bosses I've ever had, actually. But one of this managers, I was passing him in the hallway. He said, come work for me in interior. I said, no. He said, you'll get to meet women. You'll get to work with women.
Sometimes that's the best.
Surrounded by nothing but men. And
Did they not mention HR? Because I'm sure that would have
you could get away with it, right? Because you were working with.
Well, no, not in trouble with HR. I'm saying, like, if that's your metric, you should have gone into HR.
It was interesting, okay? And so I made the jump into interiors. But I had, before I even got into that, I had a really heavy involvement on the real technical side and engineering side, maintenance side, and maintenance operations side, which I've never really left. Sort of the asset management. So I was at Delta. I left Delta in the late 90s. The guy that recruited me to interiors had gone up and gone to work for PE Aerospace, the Tier 1, which is now part of Collins. And he was recruited. I was in interiors at that point in my career at Delta and had moved up into management of interiors. And he was recruiting me away to come up to North Carolina. And my wife and I were getting ready to start a family. She wanted to stay home and raise the kids. Back then, airlines didn't pay squat in engineering, and they offered me like a 50% raise, and so where we wanted to live in Atlanta, my wife would have had to work to be in the right school systems because we wanted to send our kids to public school. And this would allow her not to have to work, so moved up to BE. I was there through a couple of interesting. When I literally showed up, we were in the dump, and we were delivering 16 weeks late to Boeing and Airbus. So you can imagine, as an interior supplier,
this last week.
Yeah, right. Yeah,
no, a couple weeks ago. I mean,
has that changed?
Pretty cyclical, and they've all been through it. But I literally stepped in. The Corey brothers back then owned BE, and they were buying stuff left and right. They were buying other suppliers left and right. So I was involved in several of those. But I literally stepped in, having to get on phone calls as a program manager. Falling on my sword, saying we're going to be 16 weeks late. And clients. So I kind of worked my way through that. How I got into consulting is rather interesting. Even back in my Delta, when I was doing the aircraft spec at Delta in interiors, because I was speccing all the retrofits plus all the new aircraft, the 73NG, the 76400. I was actually one of the core team that helped design the interior, make the decisions with Boeing, because it was Delta and Continental that we were the two launch customers, and they would bring both of us into a room and then an auditorium and fill it with engineers and pepper us with questions. Like, what do you want?
The two launch customers and still the two operators.
Exactly.
Yeah,
I think there wasn't there like there was a VIP version that was also somewhere. But yeah.
Anyways, it's funny for me to kind of see that, because I remember like putting together like hundreds of different layouts, and I remember going and pitching some of them to Harry Alger. Harry Alger was the COO at Delta at the time, and I would be brought in to kind of sit down and go through as we were trying to configure the airplane. And I remember showing him some I think it was some domestic configurations, or maybe it was international configurations. And I think Harry said to me, "We will never fly these airplanes internationally. Don't ever show another layout internationally.
Never.
That's all they fly now." And it's like, it's kind of,
yeah,
it's kind of funny looking. I mean, that was almost 30 years ago. But but even back when I was at Delta, and then when I was at Collins or BE, I could see that like at Delta, I thought I knew everything, and that's just the airline mentality. Especially if you grew up in an airline, right? You're God's gift to everything aviation. I thought I knew everything about interiors. I thought we did everything right. And as soon as I got to Collins, BE, and I got exposed to real program management and sort of life outside of the insular Delta family, it was like, oh my God, was I clueless. And oh my God, were we doing so many things wrong and we had no idea. And as a supplier, right, their job is to make as much money as they can off these programs. So, a lot of it, I could see where we at Delta and other airlines, leasing companies were making the wrong decision. They were spending too much money. They were getting change costs left and right. And I'm like, wow, there's a opportunity here to go try to help people. And
so it's been 30 plus years, and I think the statute of limitations has expired. Do you have any examples? Like, this is fascinating.
I mean, it would be things like, oftentimes it'd be something like a change cost. Like an airline doesn't make a decision when they needed to make a decision by, and they waited too long. They come back and they ask you to change a decision. Now all of a sudden, okay, maybe what should have been a 10 grand cost to go back and do the engineering and retool, whatever, you can get 50 or 60 out of that if the airline doesn't know what they're talking about, and so those type of things. Or, we would see, smaller airlines that would come in and, spec a seat out, right? That was completely, it was a good seat product, but they were putting like things on it that they didn't need, right? Or they were spending too much money on, they were going to be flying hour-long flights and they wanted, 6 inches or 8 inches of recline and lumbar and all this kind of stuff on a ashtrays, but all this stuff on a seat, and you're like, it's like you're wasting money, but you can't really tell them that, so it's a lot of that sort of stuff, and I saw that, and one of our former VPs had come from Mercer, and he had just left, and I was talking to somebody who said, hey, go pitch this to that former VP, see what he thought. And I went and met with him, and he said, I've got somebody you need to talk to at this consulting firm, SH&E. And that's how I got connected with SH&E. I made a phone call. Dave Treitel and Clive Medland. Garrick, you probably remember Clive. Yeah. Clive brought me up. I pitched to them. I mean, I was like 30 maybe. I'd never done consulting. I didn't know what the hell I was doing, but I put together a little presentation. I sort of pitched this idea for new services, and they were all like, yeah, sounds like a good idea. We'll give you sort of a 6-month trial. And they gave me an analyst, they gave me a salary, and they said, come on board. And so that's sort of when I started with SH&E and started. And then right after that, that was 2000. And then obviously 9/11 happened a year later, and then U.S. Airways went under, and it was all hands on deck on asset management and bankruptcy. So that's when I got into doing asset management and bankruptcy. Was during the first U.S. Airways bankruptcy. They're like, well, the front end of an airplane from the back, and you know what an engine looks like, and so they literally put me on an airplane out to Mojave to go repossessing on behalf of all these indenture trustees, whole fleets of aircraft, F-100s, 737 classics, all that kind of stuff. And I had a couple of amazing mentors, Clive being one, John Milsom, who's now passed. He was another guy. He was an ex-People's Express, ex-Continental foreman that sort of trained me up on asset management. And then I sort of continued to grow at SH&E and got pulled into sort of everything. Treitel kept on telling me that you'll never make partner unless you move to New York. And I was like, fine, I'll be the highest paid director. I'm not moving to New York. I want to live in Atlanta. But I was traveling constantly. I was on the road. And
so were you in Atlanta at that point?
I moved.
Okay, so
that was
you
one
moved
of the
back.
things
Okay.
I wanted to move back, because when we moved to North Carolina, I had no children. Within 2 years, I had 2 kids.
It's in the water.
One was adopted. So the first one, I have 3 kids, a biological, my 2 daughters were adopted. My son's biological.
Oh, very nice.
And the adoption went a lot quicker than we expected. So my son and my daughters, the middle ones from India, they were both international. My youngest was from China. We adopted from China. But my middle, we expected to be like 2 years apart, because it was supposed to take a lot longer. The adoption happened really quick. They were only 10 months apart. So I was traveling all the time. My wife's family was here, so it was sort of part of the deal. I'll move back on my own nickel. So I've been in Atlanta since I moved back in 2000. And so I got, while I was at SH&E, they just started to, I just kind of grew up, I would say, a significant amount there, and got involved in everything from the safety and security practice. I was part of sort of the team that started the whole IOSA auditing that was based off of auditing that Sorrentino put together, ran that practice, but I was kind of one of the first auditors. And, I got into safety, security, airline operations, airline startups. I worked on a multiple number of startups, technical stuff, forecasting, Did all sorts of forecasting, not only for the Chinese, but, our fleet forecast I was involved with. Our appraisal practice I was heavily involved with as well, and kept on getting promoted till I was running what we had at that point, financial and technical services practice. And then ICF came in and bought us. And then sort of a few years later, the president and CEO left, and I was promoted up to sort of run the practice with, I had, I think, a total of 3 or 4 different partners over the last 6 years that I was at SH&E before I left, or ICF before I left. And so,
and
stayed in Atlanta that entire time.
Did not move to New York.
Stayed in Atlanta.
Good for you.
Yeah. I looked at all the folks that lived and worked in the New York office that had hour-and-a-half commutes from New Jersey or Connecticut, and their annual tax bill was about what my annual mortgage bill was. It's like, for nothing, I literally bought like a McMansion. Back when I bought here, we're pretty far outside Atlanta. It was in the boondocks. It's not anymore, but I was like, yeah, no way. Like my standard, you could pay me 5 times, and my standard of living would be cut by 3/4.
Right.
Yeah.
So
yeah.
And then I was at ICF. I stayed at ICF for 6 years after the buy, and then it was time to leave. I was sort of, the only place for me to go was sort of up at the group level, and everything was, even at the level I was, it was all about running the day-to-day internal admin of the business at my level. That's sort of what they wanted you to do. And that's not what I wanted to do. I wanted to work with clients, right? Didn't want to just travel from our office. We had 7 offices, just from, our SH&E or ICF to ICF to ICF office. I wanted to go meet with clients to do client work. And so that's when I left and started TAC. And, Tronos is a former client of mine. So the Tronos brand name, whatever, was started by a gentleman over in the UK at a leasing company, small MRO up in Canada, which is why we're incorporating Canada. And then we started an aviation machine and added a manufacturing shop up in Canada as well. But, Adrian sort of helped me start and kind of said, you call it whatever you want. I don't care. I'm investing in you. And I ended up just kind of rolling it up under his family of businesses, and have sort of continued to do the same stuff I did back that I was at SH&E. I've done, strategy, obviously the interiors forecasting, a lot of interiors work, a lot of asset management. That's probably been the 2 biggest pillars that we do are probably asset management and interiors now.
And when did you make the switch from ICF to
It was
your
2014,
own gig?
so it was 11 years ago now.
11 years.
Oh, I thought it was
Yeah.
later. Oh, wow.
I can't believe it's been 11 years. That's
I've
crazy.
had three jobs, and I've been 36 years in the industry, or 4 jobs, like 3. Yeah, it's not a lot. It's not like where people pass around.
Yeah, but you've done a lot.
Listen, we
You've
appreciate
done a
that,
lot. That's the
Gary.
thing, right?
You should have seen how long we just finished recording Subodh's podcast, and it took us forever to get through all the things that he did. Yours is like, well, there's a 10-year chunk.
Yeah.
Great.
Yeah.
Well,
It's
I
great.
worked with Subodh. We hired Subodh at SH or IC. I guess it was ICF maybe at that time.
Oh, that's right. Yeah. I
Yeah,
forgot
he's still
that you
here
had
in
that.
Atlanta.
Although, yeah, with as many places as he's been, the chance that you overlap somewhere is pretty high.
we hired him, I think, right after he finished at Jet Airways. I think was when we. Yeah.
I forgot about that.
Mm-hmm.
Goodness
So,
gracious.
yep. So that's sort of, my, I guess my, growing up in the aviation industry, and I've been really lucky that I've been able to be sort of a jack of all trades, and been involved literally in everything from airports, to airline startups, to commercial aviation, to working with OEMs, to I also do a good bit of VIP and head of state aircraft. Probably about 15%, 20% of my career has been in VIP and head of state aircraft as well. So working with mainly bigger stuff. I've done the Gulfstream and the Fokkers and some Hawkers, but it's mainly been BBJ, ACJ size aircraft.
And what type of work were you doing on those VIP? Just interior configuration, overall?
Yeah, it's been a little bit of everything. I've done some of my bigger projects have been sort of soup to nuts, helping, let's say, a high net worth individual or like a Fortune 100 company decide, do they need a private aircraft? And then what's the right aircraft for them? Is it a global? Is it a global? Is it an ACJ? Is it a PBJ? What's their mission? Kind of walking through all that, negotiating for purchase of aircraft, managing aircraft. Helping on the design. It depends on if it's a purpose-built business jet and Gulfstream or a Hawker or something like anything Gulfstream or below. We call that sort of purpose-built business jets, or either Embraer or the Bombardier. Those aircraft, it's sort of like going to the Mercedes dealer and you say, I want the EX package with, this color, right? And so those are a little bit simpler, but you're still helping them to spec the airplane and, working with their designer on color selections and all that kind of stuff. When you get into the ACJ and BBJ size aircraft, whether that's narrow or wide body, you're buying just the frame from Boeing and Airbus, and we call it a green aircraft. It actually gets delivered with just floorboards. You don't even get sidewalls. It literally is the green primer. That's why it's called a green aircraft.
It's green,
and then the interior is 100% customized. So, you buying the airplane is the easy part. It's actually getting the interior designed, certified, and installed that can take years. I mean, you can take a wide-body airplane. It could be at a completion center for over 2 years getting the interior done. And they'll often time, depending on the spec, you can spend as much on the interior as you do on the original airframe. So, yeah.
Of course. Yeah, of course. Who does that interior
work? It depends.
Work?
It's kind of gone through cycles. There are a lot of them that are gone. But the main ones now, the main big completion centers out there, you got Jet Aviation, you got Lufthansa Technique, you got Greenpoint, which is now part of Safran. You've got AMOC, they're in Basel, Switzerland, and there are a few others that do them as well. Those are probably I would say maybe the biggest ones out there kind of left in the market, that are doing aircraft. You've got other smaller ones that, that are trying to get into green completions, but are still just sort of doing more maintenance and mods. And that's like King Aerospace in Ardmore, Oklahoma. Owned by Jerry King, who actually was Associated Air Center. They were one of the big ones that went under. Gore was another big one. Gore Design that went under. That was another huge one back in the day. And then you've got Citadel Completions down in Lake Charles, and they were owned by who's the guy that owns the Sands. But I can't remember his name off the top of my head, but. That family started Citadel to basically work in their own fleet, so the casinos. They were the ones that bought, it was an L-1011, I think it was either a 250 or a 500, and they put, I don't know, maybe 80 million into that interior. It was amazing. It was done at King Aerospace, and they were going to use it to fly high net worth, the high rollers from Macau to Vegas. And whoever bought the airplane didn't do the proper performance analysis and didn't realize that they could not, in adverse winds, they couldn't make Macau Vegas in nonstop, and they had to do a tech stop. So you're not taking billionaires, high rollers with a tech stop. They literally put all that money into that airplane, put it into service, and within a few months realized the mistake and had to pull it out of service. Then they went and bought the A340s, and I think they have 2 or 3 A340s that they operate.
Wow. Yeah.
Yeah, and they also had, I think they are still operating those. They had a 74 SP too. They had a 747 SP that they used. I don't think that's still operating. Last time I saw that one, it was in Utapao, Thailand. I was in Utapao, Thailand. I was getting off a ferry. I was doing a round the world ferry of believe it or not, an RJ-85. This was Tronos. This was just a number of years ago. We were delivering it to an operator in the Philippines. That was an amazing experience to go on that sort of around the world flight in a regional jet. And I get off at Thailand, and I'm like, oh my God, I recognize here. So they had a fleet. Yeah. I snap a picture and I head it to them. Hey, your airplane's sitting here. But yeah, I think they got rid of that airplane. So.
So
Wow.
I'm interested in the Boeing and Airbus not having completion. And is that just purely a function of they just don't sell enough to have their own in-house completion center for the BBJ,
Yeah,
ACJ,
I mean, I think
or whatever they
so.
called it at the time?
To be clear, Airbus used to have ACJ. ACJ, they used to do their own completions, and that was an option.
Okay.
That you could buy an airplane and send it through ACJ. That they rolled up. I want to. It was pre-COVID. I want to say maybe 17 or 18 was when sort of ACJ stopped having their own facility to do completions at, and they still will design an airplane. I believe they still will design the interior and help manage it, but they're not turning the wrenches themselves. I think a lot of it was, it's the VIP and head of state completion is a very different animal than commercial interiors. It's craftsmanship. It's artisans that work on those airplanes. It's not wrench turners that are working on those airplanes. It's a very, very different approach. And it's much more sort of it's low. It's very low volume, and so I just don't think that Boeing and Airbus they don't sell enough to kind of say, all right, we're going to stand up on our own.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I was lucky enough to take a tour of Bombardier's completion facility at Dorval, or what is it, Trudeau now, at the end of the airport there, and it was just like you said.
Yep.
Artisans, like old school. I mean, obviously everything was state of the art inside the facility, but you had what I could only imagine is like the old, master blacksmith, and then the apprentice, but it was woodworking, and it was like the best of the best. The furniture, and then all the different the electrical, and but the majority of it was woodworking. It is.
I mean, did. There was. I remember I was doing a Middle Eastern head of state program. One of the first ones I sort of did was the MD-11, and it was being built for the Queen of the country. And they must have put $90 million on that interior. I mean, the airplane probably was worth 12 at the time. It's like the interior is, and that's the hard thing when you're trading VIP, right? The owner thinks, well, I put $80 million on that interior. Well, anybody that's buying that size of an airplane in a BBJ doesn't want somebody's secondhand stuff. So they value nothing in the interior. They want to rip it out and put their own in, or they're going to go buy new. And normally the reason why they don't buy new is because the lead time's too long and I want something quicker, right? So, but yeah.
But it's not 80 million. Like that, it's not a $92 million airplane.
No, it's
because
about
you put $80
million airplane.
Yeah.
But anyway, but the intricacy of that woodworking, this was done at Lufthansa, was absolutely stunning. I remember there were some really ultra rare Brazilian teak wood that there were I can't even remember how many $50,000 for 4 planks of this wood or whatever that was used as the inlay.
Oh, jeez.
And it really is just absolutely phenomenal craftsmanship. But funny story you brought up about the electronics, right? So I put the very first. This was back at Lufthansa. This was on a 777. I put the very first HD TV. 60-inch HD TV in a VIP wide body 777 for a Middle Eastern head of state. It must have weighed. We had to have it custom manufactured someplace in Illinois that did it, and it must have weighed like 300 pounds. And it rose out of this huge cabinet that we had about an 800-pound cabinet with pistons and everything. So you'd press a button, it would rise out of the cabinet. And now you could lift it with one hand. The stuff's so light. And then that airplane, they put a sound system. Lufthansa went, and this is out of Hamburg. They went and hired Royce Reese. So he's the guy that does Pimp My Ride. They hired him to design the audio system for this 777, and it was absolutely insane. There were subwoofers and speakers everywhere on this entire 777. It was everywhere, and it integrated with another supplier's IFE, and that we always had problems with that IFE system. I think maybe they were able to get 2/3 of the speakers working by the time the last time I heard it, what was still on the floor, but they were literally playing a movie or something. with a lot, and you could be outside on the hangar floor and like feel it in your chest, like the whole airplane shake. It was pretty crazy.
Yeah.
Is there not like vibration testing? You have to like flutter testing.
So we pimped the ride. Yeah, that 777 was.
It
would thump, thump, thump. I mean, obviously the speakers go through that, but yeah, I don't know. I don't know that they ever had it cranked up like that for the, when they were in flight. But it was a pretty amazing system on that.
One does not spend $80 million for an interior and not crank it all the way
That was a
up.
retrofit. That airplane arrived with a lighted disco dance floor.
As I thought that was standard.
To be honest.
As one does, right?
Floor and stripper poles, and all that was the family of change.
Again,
so they pulled it all out, and it was getting a much more conservative interior installed.
It gave it a good wash down.
Outside of the Pimp My Ride audio, system, everything else was pretty conservative. But yeah, that was funny. That was a fun program.
Yeah. Wow. Have you obviously worked on a bunch of different stuff, but like what other types of projects like come to mind when you think about some of the more different or interesting a
little bit of everything. So, one of the other ones we talked about sort of the 146, the RJ. I actually managed the very first conversion. It was an R&D, like a 6-year program, converting 146s into aerial fire tankers. So when you watch the news and you see them, you see the RJ 100s or the 146s fighting fires the Neptune aircraft. I managed the very first STCs on that. Now the aircraft have since changed significantly. They were, it really is like one of the true sort of R&D programs I've ever been on, where, it's so complex that it's almost impossible to try to model the flow, or was 15 years ago, out of the airplane, what the coverage is going to look like, even how quickly it's going to come out. And I learned all about aerial firefighting and the systems and how it works with how you test it. Literally, you test so you have different coverage layers, and you fly the airplane, and if they say they want a coverage level 8, then you set the 8 and you hit the dump, and it'll only dump a certain amount over a certain amount of length. And to actually test and qualify the airplane, you do what's called the Dixie Cup test. And it literally is doing like several football. I can't remember what the dimension is, but you go out on a flat field with several, football fields worth of Dixie Cups on little poles. And they normally get like the Boy Scouts to come out and put out thousands of these in a certain pattern. And then you come through with the airplane at a certain height, and you adjust the dumping and you dump. So, but that was an interesting program, just trying to get a system designed. We had a couple of really interesting failures where we had ground testing of our tank and it imploded, and as we would dump. And sort of found out that it had to do with the original company that designed it screwed up on the flow analysis, and there was too much vacuum, so we had too much going out. So
it's being sucked out by what? By gravity or the low pressure of the aircraft?
Yeah, it's not a pressure fed system. The only pressure fed system I'm aware of was the Evergreen super tanker. That was the 74200. That had a high pressure system, and because it was so big. And if you've ever seen the videos of that, when they first tested it out at Marana, they did some ground testing and they tore up the tarmac. They literally, because the water was coming out so bad,
it came out
destroyed.
Wow.
Yeah, they destroyed that it was on. So
wow.
Most of the other ones are gravity fed. I think the MAP system on the C-130 is, I think that's a pressurized system. But most of the others, like the DC-10 and the MD-80 and the 7.3 that are out there now, all of those are gravity-fed systems. But you're opening a big hole in the bottom, dropping all the water and retardant out, and then it's got to backfill with air. And
the hole in the top
wasn't big enough. And so
whatever.
We had to go find a guy who literally used to work in engines, an older guy who looked at a couple of things, literally on the back of a napkin, did this and said, "Oh, here's your problem," and we'd already been like a year trying to figure out why multiple redesigns trying to figure out how it was done, and we get one really smart aerodynamicist.
Yeah, that's crazy.
And, bam, there you go.
Yeah. Oh, so did you build a new tank, or did you get a guy in there to just
no,
hammer
we had to have multiple new tanks built, and then then we went out and did the first testing, which was sort of new. We had to do flight testing, and then we couldn't get the coverage level, so we worked with Neptune at the time to redesign it, and we put in additional. We had, I think, two dump holes. We put in additional ones forward on the forward side of the tank, and redesigned all that and did more testing. And then I think Neptune since has modified the STC, because we ended up selling the STC and the aircraft to them after years, and they sort of own it all now. But sort of the very, very first one that was done, I was involved with. That was a so I still get a little bit of interest, so to speak, whenever I see on the national news where you see one of those aircraft that I worked on flying by and doing the aerial fire dumps. So that was rather interesting.
Yeah, wow, that's pretty cool.
So and then some that's probably one of the more interesting ones. Another interesting project I worked on was I did a lot of work when I was at SH&E in China, and so I know you guys were earlier, looking at the models in the background. These are die-cast models, so they weigh I actually didn't carry them home. I made them ship them home, but this is for Kaga. So this is the J-Long, or what they call the Dragon 600, and it's the basically a C-130 size turboprop aircraft. It was based on the Harbin S5 that the Chinese Kaga, which is sort of the special projects and general aviation manufacturing arm of AVIC and the Chinese government, wanted to build a domestic aerial firefighting maritime search and rescue aircraft. And so just like we have in the United States, all the older engineers, experienced engineers, were retired or passing away. So they had a whole bunch of really young, brilliant PhD students coming through the university system that had never designed an airplane before, and certainly not a amphibious, search and rescue and aerial firefighting aircraft. So when I was at SH&E, we were hired to put together basically a team to come do a training session. And it was death by PowerPoint, 800-page PowerPoint in both Mandarin and English. And I put together a team of, I think, 5 or 6 of us that went over and basically gave them a aircraft design 101. And what's interesting was the original S5 and the original Dragon had a standard tail, cruciform tail. And some of our designers, and we talked about kind of aerial firefighting, and we talked a lot about amphibious aircraft and landing on water and takeoff, and it's not that you get downwash off the wing and that tail becomes effective at high angle of attack, as Courtney you picked up. So about a year later, I was back in China at the same facility, not working, doing another project, and the head of engineering walked in that we had presented to and came and really excited, took me up to his office to give me the other model with the T-tail on it. So that was but they were asking, you could tell these kids knew nothing. They're like, where do we put the operating table? We're search and rescue. We land in the water, and somebody needs open heart surgery. And we were all like, no, you don't do surgery when it's bobbing up and down, or you're not doing brain surgery in turbulence, okay? You literally stabilize them and use the airplane to get them to a hospital,
Generally frowned upon,
That was a very fun and interesting project. That was kind of one of the more fun ones I've worked on as well. And then I've just a wide variety. I've worked for a lot of airlines, a lot of startups as well. We did the startup back in the day of Royal Jet, which is now the largest VIP operator. I worked on the startup of MaxJet, if you guys remember MaxJet.
Oh, yeah.
Josh
Marks,
yeah. So, and I've stayed in touch with Josh, but he was like an analyst back then at fleet analyst or something back then, or financial analyst. And that one, I remember SH&E had worked on the business plan with the investors, and they bought some ex-Qantas 76200s that were a mess. I mean, they literally had been rode hard, put up wet, hadn't been touched in like probably 3 or 4 years that they'd been sitting in Goodyear. And I literally got called, I think, 8 weeks before the first flight. And they said, we need an interior. And it's all business class, high-end, business class interior to fly across the Atlantic. And our first flight is scheduled for 8 weeks. What can you do for us? It was like, okay, most interior projects take, 15 to 24 months. So...
Can't you remember those old lawn chairs you could get that lounged all the way down? Get a couple of those. Get a couple zip ties.
Yeah, zip ties. Yeah,
the seat tracks and the pole.
We ended up. I knew the industry really well. We ended up buying. I knew a guy who was getting all of the ex-Delta business class 767 business class seats, the old mechanical Weber seats that were coming out because Delta was going electric at that point with the Millenniums, which was my design back when I was at. I'd worked on the original of the Millennium back when I was still at Delta. And so we were able to buy used seats, get them refurbished, do a layout, hire an engineering company to do sort of an STC for us and get the first airplane done. And in literally 8 weeks, it was an absolute sprint.
You did it. We did it in 8 weeks.
They had their first flight in 8 weeks. And that was sort of an eye opener to be able to do that. So yeah, that was kind of interesting. And then tons of asset management stuff with all the bankruptcy work that I worked with. That was interesting. I got into expert witness litigation. Some of that was rather interesting. I had to testify I testified in Ireland. I testified in the UK in Queen's Court, which was rather interesting. And that was on a bankruptcy case, on a bankruptcy.
Did you have the wig?
I was hoping they would have the wig, and I was really upset that they didn't have the wig, actually. But because it was,
this is the whole reason I signed up for this.
It was a civil case. I was disappointed flying all the way over there. But that was the case where. What was the name of the airline? An airline had gone bankrupt and rejected a couple of airplanes back to GCAS or GCAS's finance arm. I can't remember what the finance arm was named, the GE Finance or something. And that they had done a foreclosure auction on it. And the airline or something was basically suing them to saying that they didn't follow proper procedure and they shouldn't have sold the airplanes off underneath them and all this other kind of stuff. But that was, and I was disappointed, Courtney, when they did not, have the wig.
First thing that came to mind.
Yeah, which I was thinking the same thing. I'm like, yeah, and like of course, that's the UK.
Well,
you think the
why else would you go to court?
Yeah, exactly.
So, some of the other interesting things. I once was hired. Went back at my SH&E days. I was hired to help remarket the old B-1B manufacturing hangar facility in Palmdale, California. And this was back SH&E, and so I had to go out to Palmdale and kind of walk the facility. And they were in the middle of filming The Terminal. So, seen the movie The Terminal, right? So all that, they had the mock-up of basically, JFK, and they had the background was, I think at the time, they told me it was the largest hand-painted, like the backdrop that looks like an airport is really a hand-painted, sheet, basically what it was. It was the largest one that had ever been done. Yeah. So it's kind of neat to walk around that. And then they had also done another, Hollywood, that's really all who was using it, since Lockheed or whatever had moved out. Yeah. Or whoever was doing the B-1 Northrop had moved out of that facility I can't remember the name, Hard Rain, I think was the name of the movie. And it was the one where it was a river that had flooded and there was a bank robbery going on and, they had to basically build this flooded town and they built basically a 3-foot edge. They built the entire hangar, they turned into a pool. Well, they destroyed, by having that water sit on the tarmac for a month, they destroyed the concrete, got waterlogged, and they had all these problems. So,
So they didn't put anything down. They just dumped it on the.
I think they built an edge and they sealed it, right? So they turned the entire hangar into a pool, like a 2 or 3 foot deep pool. And that most of the scenes in the movie, I think the movie's called Hard Rain. And it's got some big actors. I can't remember the name of them off the top. But yeah, most of that was filmed in that hangar as well. I remember saying, yeah, all the damage to the floor is going to cost, like $10 million to fix. And that was because of Hollywood and the movie Hard Rain that they did in that hangar. So it's like, I get involved with some weird stuff.
A little bit harder than they originally anticipated the rain to be.
That's crazy. Yeah. Huh. Wow. So if we can maybe pivot a little bit to kind of some of the stuff that you're doing today, and we all talk about supply chain issues and all the different things that, whether it's labor and material, you name it, right? There's everybody. The OEMs are delayed, whether it's engine problems, whether it's because of the seats, whether it's and those are the OEMs, right? So when you think about the stuff that you're doing today, how does all that stuff impact you, and how do you get around, not really get around that, but how do you deal with that to basically kind of keep a project moving, right? Because I'm sure you're not at the top of the priority list when it comes to these things. So how do you do that?
At the top of the priority list, but through
try
relationships, but
get one of those wigs, Gary, and see if that helps.
So, and it is, you talk to Airbus, and Airbus is constantly saying, engines and interiors, those are the two biggest things, that are holding up our production, throughput, production rates. And it is. And so, I think I have a couple of line fit programs that I'm working on now for a couple clients, as well as some retrofit programs that we're doing. And it is very much a challenge. I think at this point, some of the things you look to try to do is properly speccing the airplane and trying to spec the interior of the aircraft with products that will meet the client's requirements and mission, while minimizing opportunities for, let's say, certification or design delay, right? So how much can we tweak an existing seat product to get them what they need with the look they need and the component and the functionality they need without having to go through testing? Because testing is a big certification. Most people don't understand how complex certification is in aircraft interiors. It is, I've been in engines, I've worked in avionics on the flight deck, flight controls. Far and away, the interior is the most complex system that has to all work together. You can have 20, 30 different suppliers on a single wide body interior, and the certification requirements are constantly changing, and they are not black and white. They're very, very gray. And so what worked for you this month may not work for you next month.
Now, who decides that? Not in what you do, but in whether or not it works.
You are at the mercy of the regulator, and the way the FAA works, and the way a little bit more so than EASA, the FAA, because they're not staffed enough and haven't for 35, 40 years, they use designees. So private individuals that you hire, a designated engineering representative or a designated airworthiness representative, DAR for ferry permits, maintenance, that kind of stuff, and a DER that sort of does design changes and certification. You're reliant on them, and you ask 3 DERs or 3 DARs, and you can get 3 different opinions on how to properly interpret the rules. Because the regulations in many aspects are not black and white. And the FAA, has advisory circulars, and they're all over interiors, where an advisory circular is the FAA trying to provide some additional guidance on how you might comply with a regulation. Not the only way, but how you might do it. So, I've suffered pretty significantly. I've had programs, this is back in my Delta days, we had, to give you sort of what can be the horror story, we had 777s being delivered out of Boeing. We had the identical aircraft being, before an airplane is delivered out of either Boeing or Airbus, the regulator, remember in this one it was Boeing, but because we were taking unregistered airplanes, but the regulator has to do what they call a compliance walk, where at the very end, before you deliver the airplane, they walk through the interior and they say, does it comply with all the Part 25 interior requirements? and we had the exact same DER, walked the exact same airplane design within about 3.5 weeks of each other. He passed one and he failed the other. And you really can't go and say, well, wait a second, you did, because that's just like, you're basically telling him he screwed up. He's just going to go find 4 more things wrong that he can, for you. So you got to sort of play nice.
But don't you have like a wad of cash? You're like, if only there were something.
That may work in some areas of the world. And I've actually had not a lot of cash, but I was working with a Middle Eastern country on their head of state airplane, and they were taking a head of state, putting into a charter operation. And we went and met with the regulator, and their regulator said, here's a list of all the things you're going to need to change on this airplane. Because VIP airplanes operate under Part 91, private aircraft, so they don't have to meet the same regulations as a commercial operator, right? With interiors, there's waivers, all sorts of other stuff. They gave us a list. You got to go modify this airplane to meet all these things. And we went back, spoke with the principal and the operator, because that principal had a big operator, and they're like, it was going to be like $3 million worth of mods, and it was going to take like a year, because it was like we had to reskin all the interior, whatever. The head of the regulator was the cousin of the country's ruler, so one phone call was made. 36 hours later, we were having another meeting with the regulator, basically signing a waiver. Oh, all this stuff's good, So you get that as well in some countries.
Yeah. The old greasy palms. But so, well, I get. So my first question along a line of many questions is: have you secretly been waiting like your entire career to be like, I swear, one of these days you guys will care about supply chain. Like one of these days, it's going to be like front page news. I promise you. And we're like, okay, Gary, right? And here we are. But so this specific example that you were talking about, if I'm following it correctly, you had one DER on 2 different deliveries, but identical interiors in those deliveries of new aircraft, was it?
This is going back into the 90s, but the late 90s. Yep.
Fair enough. So these are the 200 ERs, I would assume, the Deltas. So I'm inferring from that it requires a DER to do an interior walkthrough on every single delivery.
They were doing compliance walk on every single delivery before they put the C of A on the airplane, I think that's the way it worked.
And does that still happen today?
Yeah,
that's
you still do those
today?
Compliance walks. Yeah, it's part of the process that both OEMs have that they walk through. So, I mean, that was part of the whole big thing around the MAX, right, was the delegation. This guy was actually a Boeing employee who works on the FAA. He was a designee, but when he's putting on his DER hat, he's working for the FAA, not for Boeing. And that's always been, and that was a lot of the big sort of dust up with the MAX situation was, the regulator, FAA at the time having offloaded, so to speak, delegated is the right word, so much. And then you've got the delegees that are full-time employees getting their paycheck from Boeing, right? But they're, they have to sort of build the Chinese wall internally that when I'm doing this walk, I can't care about Boeing. And, it's tough to do. I'm not saying that it wasn't done, but it's, that's sort of the perceived conflict of interest that I think raised so much concern in the industry around that situation.
But they I mean, that's not even to say that Chinese wall didn't exist, in so much as here you have a DER or AR or whichever one is, I don't know, doing the walk, but with all of the knowledge. If I'm thinking of the MAX, all of the knowledge, okay, here was a concern, but we already know how we addressed it, and we're happy with it. So it's just not a thing on the walk. I mean, that's not underhanded at all. I could definitely see how. We addressed it. This MCAS thing, but
this group addressed it. We should be okay. Yeah. A lot of it again. It's trying.
Yeah. So it's not people looking the other way. A lot of
it is trying to interpret how does it comply? Does it comply with the regulations? And that's what you get to with interiors. Sure. You've got all sorts of just gray areas in terms of how the rules are written, and then how you interpret the rule. And how you interpret complying with the rule. And it's very common. And the other thing that's so complex with interiors is a single rule within the regulations, the FARs, sort of has to be broad enough that it'll take into consideration whether it's being applied on an RJ or an Embraer 120 all the way up to an A350, right? So they have to be. And the other thing is the rules lag so. They lag timing wise way behind the development in technology, right? And technology in interiors is moves, I would say, at a snail's pace, but in the grand scheme of aviation, at a very rapid pace. Every 4 to 5 years, you're getting new technology seats that come out, right? And so, we have regulations. We had angled, we had herringbone seats. We had, seats with shoulder belts. We had video screens, right? All this stuff was new. And like the original regulations didn't consider for any of that. So now we have seats that, are pitched out at 80 inches. So what about free flail and, looking at neck injury and all this stuff. That is not uncommon that, any sort of major interiors programs, oftentimes you have what's called an issue paper, a white paper, where you're maybe doing something new that nobody else has done before. And you have to basically, write a white paper, an issue paper, and open it with the FAA and work with the FAA to say, how do we, regulations don't cover this. How do we show that it's safe? Or how do we show that this new product design or this new interior configuration meets requirements because it's new, like nobody's ever seen it before, So, we had a lot of that.
Have you had, when you think about how things change, you just mentioned that obviously how things change quite often. So because of the fact that some of these could be 2-year processes to get done, have you dealt with the fact that, you're halfway through and all of a sudden the rules change? And then you have to what do you do at that point, right? When you've already committed.
You see palms, Gary.
It's interesting in that most of the time when you're doing a new certification program, and this has to do whether you're certifying a new airplane or you're doing what we call a new STC, let's say a new interior or a new product, right? You basically open a project with the FAA or the regulator. I'm specifically more talking about FAA at this point. You open a project with the FAA, and you have a sort of a kickoff meeting, and you have your you call your project specific cert plan, your PSCP, and you agree with the FAA. We're going to freeze the regulations at this point. So any change after that, we don't have to meet unless it's like an AD, an airworthiness AD. Then it's fitted in. So,
right,
we did. Okay. I was involved and helped run for Lockheed the LM100J certification program. That was an interesting one. Lockheed basically had to recertify the C-130J into a commercial aircraft because when they wanted to bring it back. I was heavily involved in that project and ran it. And we basically had to unbeknownst to many people, most of the public doesn't know, Lockheed went through the type cert process in the late 90s on the C-130. I think it was the J, but the very early versions of the J, but never sort of got the certificate at the end. They got very near the end, but they never went through the maintenance review board process to develop a FAA approved maintenance program. So they could never put a C of A on the airplane when they delivered it. But they basically had to update everything. And when we launched that program, it would have been around 2011, 2012, maybe 2013 with Lockheed. We met with the FAA and said, these are the rules we have to meet up until today. And anything new that comes out, you won't have to meet, right? And that's how you get, up until a number of years ago, right? Boeing still delivering 767-400 or 300s that, still only had to have 9G interiors on it, even though 16G's been around since the late 80s. It's because the type certificate of that airplane was locked in, back in the early 80s when there was no 16G.
Or 149 seats on a 737.
Yeah, exactly. So you lock it in, and then mods. You just have to meet the level, and usually mods that you do to that airframe only have to meet the level of certification that the type certificate had to meet. Sometimes the FAA says no, and depends on the way the rule is written. But Garrick, to go back, I think it was you that asked the question. If there are, oftentimes contracts will be written with the suppliers that say, if the rules change and we have to meet more certification, that's on you. That's not on me. I'm not taking the risk. So, we have had that happen where the FAA will roll out an AD or a new rule and then say, even though we agreed a year ago, well, this is a critical enough safety rule that you're going to need to meet it, and you're going to need to go back and test, and roll that into your program. Yeah. So that you're never immune to that, and that becomes a concern as well.
I want to talk about the current supply chain challenges, because you bring perspective that we're more OEM and beyond. You're kind of OEM and down through the supplier chain, which is where it's all at right now. Again, you waited a long time, and I'm less happy to tell you that what you do is suddenly incredibly important. It always has been. It's just now we admit it. So since Delta, you worked there, you were talking about the 777s, they've disclosed that they have, I don't know if they've delivered yet, but 321 Neos that originally they just pulled the engines off to use the spares. I think the original, not excuse, but the original reason was tariffs. But then once tariffs weren't a thing, we find out that there was an interior certification issue on 321s. I'm not sure if they got those passed, but again, not throwing stones at Delta. This must be happening all over. This is just kind of one of the examples that we know about. Well, I guess more from a industry trend perspective, is that something we're seeing everywhere? It is a
trend, and that trend is driven by more new rulings and interpretations of existing rules by the FAA on seat certification. So seat certification programs have become incredibly more risky than they were even 3-4 years ago. And most of it, I think, is just how the various regulators are interpreting the rules that they've been interpreting forever. They're just sort of changing the way they want you to test, then things they want you to measure. They are coming out with some new rules as well on like I said, neck injury and free flail and other sorts of stuff, and how you do HIC tests and head injury criteria tests, and sort of room for error is extremely small in these, and these programs are extremely high risk. So what used to be, okay, if we had to do a new seat testing, we could still do it in 18 months. Now most suppliers are like, man, we don't even want to do it in 24 months if there's testing. Like, we can't guarantee. And so there are a number of programs that I am running one program where we have had multiple failures that we absolutely, from a very qualified, experienced interior seat supplier, and they're struggling to pass some certification issues that we just never saw coming. The seat's failing. We didn't expect it. And I think Delta, and not just Delta, we talked about the 321 Neos, Delta's suffering the same thing. Where the seat supplier, it's not really Delta's, but the seat supplier, Lufthansa is suffering the same thing on theirs as well, on their Allegra, where they're really struggling to get. So it's all the suppliers are dealing with it, and on top of that, you still have a lot of, when you look at interiors, there are a number of things that are causing the supply chain issues. That's number one, or one of the issues is certification. The other one is the engineering bottleneck, and that's always been one for years and years and years. It's been a big bottleneck, is engineering capacity. So if you are when you're designing a new interior, when you're designing a new galley, you're designing a new seat for a airline, there's a lot of work that goes into that from an engineering perspective, and from a supplier's perspective, right? Small airline X comes to me and they have a fleet of 10 airplanes. They want to redo their, 787s with a new seat, right? And I have a set engineering capacity, and it's the same amount of work if I do it for them or if I go do it for Delta, who needs 350 ship sets of that same seat, right? So it's
Yeah,
one
it's one
design,
design,
right?
yeah.
And so, it's always been that bottleneck, and the supplier is going to say, where am I going to make the most money? I don't make it on engineering, I make it on delivery of the product. I'm going to allocate that to Delta, right? In this much bigger program. So it's really hard for the smaller airlines and leasing companies and stuff to sort of so engineering has always been that big bottleneck. During COVID, a lot of the seat suppliers, they lost 30, 40, 50% of their staff,
Yeah.
right?
On the engineering side or just in general?
And a lot of that on the engineering side. Wow. And they have not been able to backfill that. And there was an enormous amount of industry knowledge that left that's no longer there. And they really struggle, right? The suppliers are struggling because they've lost so much kind of, industry knowledge by the retirements and people that left and said, I'm not dealing with aviation anymore. I want to go get a more stable job. And so that's another one, would be sort of engineering capacity and certification engineering capacity, and just generic supply chain, and shipping and raw materials, depending on what the materials are. Seats, the vast majority of seat suppliers have moved much more to sort of the Boeing, and Airbus, mantra, where they're really doing design and then they're doing assembly, but they're not doing a lot of the manufacture. Most of the manufacture in interiors and seating was offshored to, Mexico and other sort of lower labor, places. So a lot of those suppliers were panicking around tariffs, because, all the equipment, interiors equipment, you get a seat that ships out of the US, but 90% of that material is being manufactured in, either in Asia or in Mexico, and having to come in, right, and then be assembled. So you've got the supply chain issues associated with that, that you do with automotive and anything else. And that's the other one with sort of that supply chain. But engineering, I would say engineering and certification even more so than, just actual, assembling a seat.
So there were kind of three, I'll call them top level issues that you identified there that make a lot of sense, right? Certification, obviously. The engineering bottleneck, I mean, this is the first I've kind of heard it prioritized as the number 2 issue. That's very interesting, which is I'm sure it's also a function of certification, just the number of engineers you need, but then just labor in general. The third being shipping, which of course would be just slowed down through COVID. You mentioned kind of overall supply chain issues, but those are all just kind of, the different, each layer has its own level of impact. There's one that you haven't talked about yet that I'm curious your take on, and that we keep hearing about, is just the ability for these shops to ramp up. Is that a subset of all those? Is it a financial bottleneck? Is it engineering? Is it just labor?
So we do put out. I do put out my interiors forecast, which is production, and whatever. We've seen this multiple times now in my career during the last 3 or 4 downturns, right? Interior spend is discretionary. You can fly an airplane with old seats on it. So that's the very first thing that gets cut. And airlines don't invest in it, while most airlines don't invest in it during the downturn. And then so there's this big pent-up demand. And then once you get on the backside where they're starting to make money again, they get 3, 4, 5 quarters of good financials. Okay, we've ignored the interior for the last 4 or 5 years. Now we need to go upgrade our seats, right? And we need to upgrade our IFE. And we're in that now. We're post-COVID. There is massive volume coming. There's, and suppliers are turning away work because, I've had a number of different programs where I've gone to seat suppliers and they're no bidding work because they don't have capacity. So, so you are seeing this huge pent-up demand. You're seeing suppliers that shut down factories, that lost people, that are no bidding work. And, the capacity that the industry has today versus the demand that's out there today is a significant gap. And we're still sort of wondering, you're seeing delays where, airlines are not retrofitting airplanes as quickly as they wanted to. And that's just solely a function of the interior supply chain not able to react quick enough. And I think, the interiors businesses in general have always been very cyclical. And the way the cyclicality works is, they want to make as much money as they can. The big companies go out there with huge, sales forces, and they sell, and they win, and they get over capacity. And then they start falling behind, and then they're not delivering on time. And then they get kicked off offerability at Boeing and Airbus, and then their market share falls off, their volume share off, their revenue share falls off, and it takes a couple years for them to kind of, swallow that big pill and then try to regroup. They lose sales, they lose market share, and then it sort of equilibrizes. Yeah, equalized.
Equalized.
And then...
But we knew what you meant.
And then they need to grow again. And, growing in this industry, it's a very, the other thing with interiors is it's not the same widget that you're just turning a crank. And it's, every seat for, you could have the same model of seat that goes on different airlines, or that even goes on the same airline, but different aircraft types, and it's a different seat. So it's not like, so it's a very low volume, very high engineering intensive program. And because of that, it's not easy to ramp up. And it's not easy to ramp up production. It's not easy to ramp up engineering. It's hard getting people. It's hard getting facilities. It's hard getting the backup for that. And so there's this disparity that we've seen before. This is not the first time I've seen it in the industry.
Yeah. I mean, I remember before COVID, we had seat supplier issues leading in, and this is where it was kind of across the spectrum, at least on the aircraft types. But I think the big push at the time was getting the 320 rate up into the 60s, and they struggled with that. So I'm taking these. We just use the term supply chain challenges, right? But what I'm really interested in here is just kind of hear from you what that means, like what that really is, and if we just apply these challenges as unique as they are in the interior space, but take into account the other unique elements that would hit different parts. I mean, all the way down to even and then just apply that down the chain. We heard all about
those issues, right? Even hardware. We had the factory burn. I mean, I think the other 800-pound gorilla that's in the room, that I was beating that drum 10 years ago at Speed News, at the Speed News supply chain conference. It's the first time I brought it up, was access to data for the retrofit. When you look at the interiors business, right, interiors is about split between line fit and retrofit. But as we get more and more, the fleet gets bigger, and retrofit, it fluctuates about 50-50. Oftentimes retrofit's bigger than line fit in terms of the size of the market. Every time you do a retrofit, there's a new STC, there's new certification to bring that product or change that. I mean, if you move a seat 1 inch on any aircraft, just one seat, 1 inch, it's a new STC, right?
That's why I never recline. I mean, maybe if I did, it'd get you more business, Gary.
Where it's installed, not just there you go. You move where it's installed. That's UXTC. So, it used to be on the old aircraft, the 777, the 76, the 75, the classic 300, even the NGs, the COs. Data was everywhere, and you need data to be able to certify. And what's happened is, rightly so, Boeing and Airbus realized we spend tens of billions of dollars developing these airplanes. We're giving away sort of this IP. People are modifying these airplanes, and we're not getting the license. We're not getting payout for it. So on Max and on the 787 and the A350, they clamp down on data access. And I'm not aware, it may be out there, but I'm not aware of a single 787 retrofit or modification that has been done by the industry without the involvement of Boeing. So there are two things that are the biggest problem. Number one, Boeing is really good at designing and building new aircraft. They're not great at retrofit planes. They think they are, but they're not. This is not in their DNA. And they do it, but they're. I've done a number of programs with BGS over the years, and it can be a struggle. They're really good at designing. They have access to all the data, but it's a total different mindset when you modify airplanes. Yeah. And so you're reliant either on having to go and normally spend 2, 3, 4, 5x to have the OEM do the engineering versus what you can get at aftermarket third party. And their schedules often are 2, 3, 4, 5x, just because they're engineering limited like everybody else, right? Or you hire a third party, and that third party has to enter into an extremely expensive data agreement with Boeing or Airbus and the OEM to get access, very limited access, just to that data. And who's footing the bill? The airline or the leasing company.
You can't just go in with a tape measure.
You can do some of that, and there is some of that goes on. But you're pretty limited in what you can do. Yeah, you're pretty limited in what you can do. But I mean, back in the day when we were at Delta, we would buy the airplane. This is back in the 80s and 90s. We would buy a new order, and included in that order was you're going to give us all the data. And we literally had libraries at Delta, entire rooms filled up with, this was back in the day before like computers, with the analysis, that literally the structural analysis and fatigue analysis that Boeing did on those airplanes. Interesting story. I once was working on DC-9 landing gear, and we were doing a repair of a landing gear on a DC-9, and I was 23 years old, just out of college, and I couldn't get the analysis to make sense. The original analysis was wrong. I was like, oh my God, wait, how did it go from this number to this number? Well, we miscalculated, Now, luckily it was still positive margin of safety, or DC-9s would have been, crashing. The landing gear would have failed.
Well, that's why they built those things out of tempered steel.
But it was just that was sort of one of the very first sort of eye-opening things I had, that, the OEMs are not know-it-all, know-all, be-all.
No.
Yeah, that's right, yeah.
You
heard it here first, folks. You heard it here first.
Very, very early in my career, I did learn that, and we had a couple of others. We had we had a major failure on some landing gear on the 7.6, and came very close to grounding the 767 fleet back in '93. It was 1993, and we at Delta had two failures. We had one failure, contacted Boeing. They said it's an anomaly. We had learned that I think Ethiopian had a failure about a year beforehand. And we internally disagreed with Boeing. And we had about a 6-month head start before we had our second failure that had the gear separate during taxi. Granted, nobody was hurt or anything, but the airplane was...
It's like after a hard landing or something?
The worst part of a landing gear is when you're taxiing out fully loaded with fuel. That's when the gear is most stressed, because you're so heavy.
Even on rotation?
Yep. And normally it's like a lot of the gear parts, they're most highly stressed when you're actually making a turn, like onto a taxiway at full fuel. And that's when this let go. And so, but we were about 6 months ahead in developing. We had already done our own investigation, figured out what we thought the problem was, why this main joint on the 7.6 gear was failing. And the NTSB wanted to ground the entire 767 fleet. I was on those very early calls between the FAA and Boeing. And, right after those calls, Boeing, the landing gear group at Boeing, called us and
Yeah.
hat in hand and said, "You're 6 months ahead of us. What have you done? How have you fixed it? What'd you find?"
Yeah. Oh, you want our data?
Yeah.
I was too young and naive to get out my, to get out my.
Yeah. You're probably like, Boeing's calling us for help? Yes. Yeah.
But, you sort of learn that, okay, they got to rely a lot more. The operators know these airplanes so much better than the OEMs usually. Right.
Well, in fairness, I mean, you can do non-destructive or even destructive testing to your heart's content, but operation is just
which is why in a maintenance review board, right, it's led by you have operators on that board, and they're as critical, if not more critical, having the operators on that board than the OEM, because once the aircraft get older, the operators know a lot more about what goes wrong and how to fix it than the OEMs do.
Okay, so what breaks this bottleneck that we're currently in?
I mean, I think, another downturn.
besides choosing amazing
another
consultants?
downturn. It's oftentimes what gives them time to recover. I don't know that any interior suppliers in and of itself is sort of willing to take the risk just to go hire it and win the business. More often than not was sort of as we had under the old SH&E days, win the business and then we'll figure out how to deliver, right? That's sort of how, Tritel used to run it. We always found a way to get it done, but, it was on a much smaller scale than, ramping up production. And I think the suppliers are always a little bit hesitant to ramp up production. Now, and you've also got suppliers now that are part of huge conglomerates, right? So Collins, the interiors business of Collins has had a couple of really big layoffs recently. And Safran's had the same thing. Collins isn't, the only one. A lot of them have had layoffs because their financials aren't great. So, it's the same thing that the airframe OEMs have. I can't bill, right? I can't bill and get paid for this product until it rolls out my door. I can't get it rolled out fast enough. So I'm losing money because I'm building and not taking the money in. And so you get the bean counters that come in and just say, cut heads, right?
Which almost snowballing in the wrong direction.
Yeah, it's counterproductive. Counterproductive. Absolutely.
We're suffering that on a couple of programs where we have had, and this is actually on some line fit programs we're working on, where we've had very experienced people on those programs get laid off, and very experienced engineering get laid off because who do the bean counters lay off? The most expensive people, right? But you lose all that knowledge that goes with them, and you really struggle to try to recover. And so, unfortunately, it's just sort of the nature of that business. I don't know that I have the golden bullet, the silver bullet of, what gets us out of this other than, somebody sort of biting the bullet and doing the investment ahead of time. But it's a significant problem that's not going to get better as the industry continues to recover, because the pent up demand for retrofit is huge. The pent up demand for new aircraft is huge, and it's in about 85% of it's the same supply chain. So they're fighting against each other.
Yeah. Is there a scenario, just talking in the very short term here, so 2025, is there a scenario where those Delta seats get certified, those Lufthansa seats get certified, and suddenly Airbus books a couple dozen orders in a month?
Although I don't know that the orders...
Do they all just ship at once?
A lot of the stuff, it really sort of depends on how the programs are going. What you start to see is you see Boeing and Airbus saying, screw it, we're not holding up delivery because of seats. So you're taking the airplane line, you're paying for it, and then the seats are your problem, right? So you deliver without the seats. And, I think Delta did some of that, right? You mentioned aircraft now the desert, right?
Yeah. Well, they took the engines,
I think Lufthansa did the same, right, with some 787s, right, where they had some issues, and so they took the airplanes.
It's not. I can tell you, it probably was not their choice. Take the airplane,
correct?
Right,
right. But these are BFE seats, right?
Yeah.
Yep.
So they correct.
So
and so
is this? Go ahead, Gary. I'm sorry.
No, go ahead.
Well, we have you here to talk. Nobody wants to listen to me.
No, what's your question?
No, what I want to know is, coming up to the end of the year, if I'm looking at like Airbus specifically, they've been short on hitting their delivery targets, and they always have that November-December spike. But they didn't used to, but they do now. How much of that, in your estimate, is Airbus just being like, well, look, it's end of year, so you're taking the airplane?
I think it's a significant amount of that. We got to make our numbers. It's BFE. You took the risk. So, when you think of why you do BFE, there are a number of reasons why you would do BFE. One of them is you have it opens up you to being able to use more suppliers. It allows you to do more customization. So small airlines normally aren't going to do BFE because it's a bigger risk. They're paying for it directly. Oftentimes the airline can negotiate better pricing. But as part of that, you're taking a risk as an airline that you're in charge. You are responsible for the delivery of that equipment. That equipment doesn't show up on time. You're going to have to either take the airplane, or if it shows up late, then Boeing and Airbus are going to charge you $1 million for late delivery. And now we've got to change our production flow to build, to put your seats in at this position as opposed to where we wanted to here. So, that sort of goes into the BFE. But at the end, it's like, yeah, we got to push it out. We got to make our annual numbers. What you do often find, depending on what the delay is, so the suppliers, the interior suppliers will have the waterfall charts and the build rates that the OEM and the airline originally, agreed to. And now those are shifting a lot. But oftentimes, if you have Boeing and Airbus pushing deliveries off, they're not, oftentimes they're trying not to flow those delays down to allow the supplier to delay too late. So oftentimes a seat supplier maybe has 5, 6, 7 ship sets built, but Airbus isn't ready to deliver because they're late on engines, but they want to deliver 6. Well, the supplier may have 6 sitting in their warehouse ready to ship. So it sort of depends on what's causing the delay. But once the suppliers have something designed and certified, for them to churn out the same part number is oftentimes that end, sort of the last step, is oftentimes not the limiting factor, that they can churn them out usually in a relatively quick, time frame. And you're not going to be 6-8 months late unless there's 1 or 2 key components where the supply chain is completely broken down with those components.
Yeah.
I do want to, first of all, I want to let Garrick ask some questions because I've been hogging the airtime again. But before we end, don't end yet, Garrick. I want to know about freighter conversions a little bit.
What do you want to know?
Well, okay. I'll ask the question, Garrick, unless you want to.
No, you can go ahead. You're doing a great job asking the questions. No, it's okay.
Garrick said almost nothing. You were kidding.
Dude, listen. This is how it goes. And then I cry myself to sleep at night, and Garrick laughs at me. Well, so you talked about, since COVID, doing a lot of freighter conversions. Just that retrofit, if we can call it that, more conversion process. But I'm really more interested on the narrow body side. Just because it's easier to compare a 7.3 with like a 321 or a 320 in that conversion process, how are those two platforms different in just how you approach a conversion?
We've done both. I've managed a number of 321s, both the precision conversion and the EFW conversion, and those two are different. And then all the 7.3s we've done, they've all been 800s and they've all been AEI conversions. So those are the ones that I'm most familiar with. I can tell you that the biggest difference between the two is Boeing aircraft are built like tanks, and Airbus aircraft are not. And I'll almost call it maybe the design margins that are built into sort of the structure of the airplane. I would say it's significantly easier to design and modify the 7.3 than it is the A321. The A321 has just much, much, much thinner margins on it than the 7.3 does, and so it's much less forgiving. And you also have the 321 is the fly-by-wire system was a huge issue, and for like people like Precision, right, that had to get access to that because you're having to move some of those wire looms and shit and that stuff, and it becomes really a pretty big situation. That's why sort of Airbus always thought nobody was going to be able to do it but us. But Precision was able to sort of find a way to work with Airbus to get whatever they needed to. And then those airplanes are so much more they're so much more computerized than even the NG, that kind of turning the airplane back on at the end of the mod, You never know.
You never know, huh?
It literally can take weeks to sort of debug all the errors you get when you plug everything back in and try to power it on. So
you don't have like a priest come in and sprinkle holy water around.
Every single one of the completion of the mod centers that we went to that did the 321, I think in hindsight they wish they'd hired a priest to come in and with holy water to try. Because it was a, and we did 1, 2, 3, 4, I think 5 of the 40 modifications we did. I was actually the very first airplane being done by that mod center. So not the first one being done of the mod. The engineering was already done but I was the first one taking an airplane through that mod center. That was an additional, it's a different beast than doing a heavy check. But sort of some examples would be like, you're opening up a 7.3. One of the biggest problems that kitting was a little bit, the supply chain was a little bit of a challenge in the meat of the supply chain problem. The suppliers, the conversion houses were having issues trying to get doors built and that kind of stuff. But that really wasn't, I would say on 90%, 95% of the ones we did, the long pole in the tent was maintenance. And the long pole in the tent was, finding whether it was parts that just, were going bad that you found bad during the heavy maintenance, or even more so was as you're doing the modification, you find corrosion or cracks in areas that are affected by the STC, right? That you're modifying because of the STC. And on the Boeing aircraft, you have just a lot more. It's a much heavier built airplane. There's a lot more leeway in finding stuff and being able to deal with it than with the Airbus airplane. It's just a lot more, I would say engineered to design sort of more towards the edge of the envelope. Still very safe and all that kind of stuff. It's not built like a tank,
Still very safe.
I would say it's like a Humvee as opposed to like, an Abrams. Right?
An Abrams. Well, that's still maybe like a Bradley to an Abrams.
An M1 Abrams. But it was, so just seeing a lot of that with what we dealt with, and, finding, variances, like maybe in the design. The other thing that was really difficult is you would go into the modification and it was, you would open things up and start to find where the spec of the airplane is and what you expected. And it's a little bit different. Then you'd have to do re-engineering. You'd find repairs, double repairs and stuff in areas that you didn't know they were there. And there are areas that are impacted by the change in how you're taking the load for the door or the aft, load in the floor, whatever it is, just a lot of that type of stuff that you would run into. And that's where most of the delays, ended up being around that sort of.
Yeah. So one of the things that we've heard like multiple times is when it comes to the Airbus product is I've been told, look, an A320 is not, an A321, right? Each A321 is different from the other. And so therefore, when you're going through the conversion process, you're starting with a different airplane every time. So if you've got, 6 airplanes that you're doing, each one is probably different from one another and it takes that much longer to go through it. Have you found that? And then how does that compare to, are the Boeing aircraft less like that? Or not?
Maybe a little bit. I think what you look at is that there are a couple things. Number one is the spec of the airplane, right? So, every airplane comes out is built to the first basically operator spec. So with avionics, with, systems on board, with carbon versus metal brakes versus, do they have a cargo system in it? So all of it, does it have ACTs? If it's an Airbus, does it have aux tanks? Like every airplane spec is a little bit different. And so you do get that and that was sort of one of the big things. I would say the pre-input spec review on Airbus was significantly more complex than the pre-input spec on the Boeing aircraft. And again, it's you run into the exact same thing when you do interior mods, where people think, oh, I'm going to do one layout and I'm going to put these seats on, but I want to do it on this fleet of 50 airplanes. Well, let's say they're all whatever BA aircraft, but they're not all BA bought a whole bunch of secondhand aircraft over the 10 years that they've operated these. So you've got some BA aircraft, you got some ex-Ryanair aircraft, you got some ex-Lion Air aircraft, whatever it is, you got an amalgamation. On the skin, they may look the same because they're painted the same, but the interior and the structure and the systems are all different. And so with every single aircraft you do that starts at a different point with a different spec, now is a modification to the STC. And so it is like starting anew. It's not like you're having it's not like, okay, the frames are in different locations or the stringers are in different locations, but you impact so many things in those with the electronics, the ECS, the fire suppression, flight control, all of that, and any variances that one may have over another with maybe different vent outlets or whatever. I mean, just kind of throwing stuff out there, or different avionics or whatever, or a different fire suppression system. Now all of a sudden, you can't use the same engineering package you used on the airplane before. And so unless the aircraft are identical sister ships, like, okay, you bought two 737-800s from Delta, they were 4 serial numbers apart, so they're the same build, and Delta was the original owner of both of those. Those very likely you're not going to have, unless there's a doubler somewhere on one versus the other. Those would basically be identical aircraft. But normally you don't find. Most conversions are not sister ships. They're onesie twosie, right? An airline's going out and buying onesie twosie here for feedstock, and then it is very much like every program is a different program. Yeah. Does that answer the question?
Wow. That's really interesting. Oh yeah, that's really interesting.
Wrapping up the conversion, this is where I thought you were going to go, Garrick. But we've had a lot of completely ignorant discussion and debate around the potential for converting carbon fiber fuselages and cutting a hole into it. And I know that answer has not been resolved yet. But why did I just feel your blood pressure double? What's going through your head? Like what type of challenges are we looking at for something like this?
The biggest challenge you're looking at is, I think, the only one with the capability to do that is going to be Boeing. Because they're the one with the data.
Yeah.
They're the only one with the data on the 787.
And by data in this context, you're not necessarily talking like what I would think of as like blueprints. You're talking about data. Like the stress data. The stress data.
So you find is the way most of this stuff is done in aviation when you look at aftermarket mods, the vast majority of it, you're trying to keep the load and through the fuselage and around the fuselage and on the frames, that you're trying to keep the load within the original design envelope of the aircraft. And so you need to have access to that sort of, what was the edge of the envelope that it was designed to. And then any modifications I want to do, I want to make sure I'm not overloading any part of the airplane. So I want to keep it within that. I'm not trying to expand to say the airplane can now carry more load. I'm trying to say I'm going to modify it, but overall it's carrying the same load and the same stress paths and the stress paths and everything. And I think when you get into carbon fiber, I think it's much less about, can you mod carbon fiber? I'm sure we can find ways to mod carbon fiber and put in doublers and all that kind of stuff, cut a hole. It's going to be very different from doing it on aluminum, right? But I'm sure from a technological and engineering standpoint, it could be done. It's going to be access to the data. And I think the other thing is, where do you put the door in all the electronics and fly-by-wire systems, the terabytes of data and the sensors that are all over these airplanes? Now all of a sudden become a much more complex modification of what are you impacting, how are you changing things in those systems. Just like the 321 versus the NG. I mean, you literally need like an IT department when you refire up the 321. And yet, in the multiple aircraft we did, especially the ones where it was the facility's first airplane, we literally set aside like 3 weeks from the time we thought the airplane would be done to the time we actually expected it to redeliver. And most of that was troubleshooting, the avionics systems on the airplane, because you're plugging everything back in and what's not going to work.
Is that more involved than, say, a D-check? I would assume they unplug and power down apps. I mean, obviously they power it down.
I think it's a lot more than a D check. Because in a D check, you're powering stuff down, but you're not disconnecting and moving stuff all around. And in a conversion, you're modifying everything enough that you're now having to start disconnect, move, new wire looms, rewire, wire around structure that wasn't there before. There's just a lot more that goes into it, and so it is much more complex than a check. Because remember, with check, right? A D check is effectively open and inspect. That's what the check is, and then really all a check is it's open and inspection. Now the repairs are the non-routines out of the check. The actual check itself is just open and look. You're not normally, if you're doing modifications, that's above and beyond what a heavy check is. You're just in a D check or a heavy check, you're opening more and you're looking at more, but you're not disconnecting, all that kind of stuff usually.
I remember getting back when I was still in the cockpit, getting into CRJ 700 at 5 a.m. in the morning in Bangor, Maine, minus 46. That's my record. And guess who did the walk around? And hitting the battery switch to fire up the APU and looking at the avionics, and the captain and I were like, it's never done that before. It's just weird things happen that you think, it's a closed loop system. Electrons move here and there, and it doesn't matter if it's temperature. It doesn't matter if you unplug and replug it in. Weird things happen, like gremlins. Like the gremlins.
We've had so many gremlins on these airplanes. Even more recently, we had one on a delivery that we did of a 7.3 to a new operator, and they were getting all sorts of, like spoiler faults, and they even got Boeing involved, and Boeing was struggling to try to figure out what was going on. It was one of these gremlins that it would only occur at 36,000 feet, and I think we ended up figuring it was after it got cold soaked, But, the other thing that goes in, what's interesting is you bring that up, right? The other thing, most of these conversions, because they get delayed, I literally had conversions. I had airplanes that celebrated their second birthday, like 2 years of a conversion that was supposed to last 4 months. So a variety of reasons.
Still being converted,
What happens when an airplane sits for more than about 3 weeks? Avionics start to go kaput, right? So you have an airplane that now has been sitting, let's say, for a year without power. And now you try to power it up, and it's just literally failure after failure after failure after failure. So
it's like, wait a minute, all the clocks are blinking 1200.
We had a very experienced guy on our team who had been doing line maintenance for several Latin American airlines for years. And he was literally the guru on the A320 avionics system. And without him, these airplanes never would have been like the MROs that we had them at. They had some avionics guys, but they were completely it was so far beyond what their capability was that our guy would work like 20 hours a day in the cockpit trying to help them troubleshoot and fix. I don't know what we would have done without. You really need somebody with that level of expertise on site, when you're doing these conversions, because it's very complex.
I feel that so personally. I can't get my printer to work. Right? Like, we've all had that.
Yeah.
I couldn't even imagine that guy. He's like, great, everything's working, passes all the checks, they take it up to 360 and like explore a fault. They come back and he's like, no.
But it just worked. Literally great.
Right. It just worked.
It's impossible. Yeah. What are you doing?
So we actually had we had another guy that this was on a 7.3, but we had the operator asked us to send in our guy multiple times because our guy was much more experienced. This was one of the first airplanes this operator was operating, and they were really struggling. And so we were sending in our guy to help them troubleshoot. He was up in and out of their facility probably for about 3 months, off and on, trying to help them troubleshoot, from item to item.
See, this is exactly why I am in no way concerned about AI taking over humanity. Because there's going to be this. There's going to be that one guy who's like, oh yeah, just pull the plug. Or, just shake it. I mean...
Right, yeah. That's right. AI is not going to be able to...
But it's
know to shake it, right?
that cultural memory, right?
Yeah.
Which, by the way, to your point earlier, we lost during COVID in mass.
Yeah.
And there's always, I'm glad to hear this guy's a hero. I don't know who he is, but he is. He is now a hero.
You lose that tribal knowledge every time there's a big recession. The very first time I ran into it was in the first recession in my career, which was in '93. At Delta, and they had the first. We did not have layoffs, but they had the first. They were close to the first layoffs, and back then the 75-year history, and they had early retirement packages, and a lot of guys, took them, and we started seeing some stuff really scary in the back shops. Where there was this push to turn like landing gear and engines really quickly, and you had a bunch of young AMPs that didn't understand why there was a 10-step process when you're going to plating something, and they were like, oh well, it says to heat treat it for 3 hours, but I got to pull it out in 2, and so we ended up, myself and another engineer at Delta ended up like having to panic develop classes on exotic metals and processing, and gave it to the entire, back shops. We had to run everybody through. We had like show and tell and stuff, a hydrogen embrittlement, and this is why you don't skip this nidal etch step, and all this other, because we were starting to see, kind of, again, it was losing that tribal knowledge during a downturn. Yeah. All the guys with the gray hair that knew why and what we did and that we couldn't skip it, they all took early retirement. And the guys that were left were being told by their bosses, you got to cut down a week on the turn time of this landing gear. And they didn't,
I hope they hired them back as consultants and paid them extra.
Which that happens sometimes, right?
That happens a lot,
how you try to get them back, and they make a little extra cash here and there, but some guys are just kind of like, I'm done.
There were a lot of guys at Delta that we called them double dippers, and some of them even triple dipped. They were getting their retirement, they were back working on contract. But that happens sort of every cycle.
Well, look, Gary, it's been almost 2 hours, thanks to Courtney, no, it's been absolutely fantastic. Kind of hearing your thoughts on this stuff. All this stuff's really interesting. It's definitely a side of the industry that people deal with, but they probably don't think about on a regular basis, right? So it's been really, really cool to kind of get your view on what's going on. So would like to thank you for being on, and it's always nice to chat with you. And we'll definitely, hopefully have you on at another time, see what's going on at that point, with the whole interior world.
Fun. I've known both you guys. Garrick, I've known you, I think, for a good bit longer than even. But
he's way older.
He and I both are way older. But it has been a pleasure, and I really appreciate being on. So thank you very much.
Garrick and Gary. Oh, this is gonna be a tough one, guys. That's interesting, because I'm kind of building up the spectrum between.
You're definitely on the spectrum, yeah.
Yes.
You're welcome.
Yes. Well said. I'm glad it didn't stop recording.